Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, not because your alarm went off or your phone buzzed, but because your breath has turned into a tiny ice cloud and your toes are flirting with frostbite. Welcome to winter in medieval Europe, where luxury meant not dying overnight. For peasants, the cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a full-blown enemy, a season that didn't ask permission to enter your home because, frankly, your home was a few rotting sticks and a generous smear of cow dung pretending to be a wall. These were not houses. They were slightly warmer versions of being outdoors. No insulation, no glass windows, just holes stuffed with animal hides and hopes. If you were lucky, your roof was only leaking a little and hadn't collapsed under the weight of snow yet. And the wind? Oh, the wind. It wasn't politely knocking. It was barging in like it paid rent, slicing through every gap in your thatch like a thief in the night, stealing every drop of warmth your sorry little body managed to generate. There was no thermostat, no warm blankets, no radiators humming in the background, just the grim knowledge that you were one bad gust away from becoming a peasant-shaped popsicle. The interior of your hut was only marginally less cold than the outside, but at least it didn't come with wolves. Nights were the worst. Darkness fell like a hammer and brought with it the kind of cold that made your bones feel like they were made of glass. The fire, if you had one, coughed and sputtered in the middle of the room, pouring more smoke into your lungs than heat into your feet. The side closest to the flames was warm enough to toast your shins. The other side? Frozen solid. Congratulations, you're now the proud owner of a half-thawed human body. No matter how many layers you wore, scratchy wool tunics, a suspiciously smelly cloak, or rags wrapped around your legs like makeshift insulation, you could still feel winter crawling through every seam like a creeping death. Beds, don't even think about it. You slept on sacks of hay, if you were lucky, or a pile of straw thrown directly onto the dirt floor. You weren't lying down so much as awkwardly folding yourself into a shape that kept the fleas mostly away from your face. The straw crunched, it poked, it moved. Sometimes you weren't sure if the rustling beneath you was your bedding or something alive. And then there were the walls, if you can call them that, cobbled together from wattle and daub, sticks smeared with mud, straw, and yes, dung. Because dung was free, and it stuck to things. Dung was survival. Medieval home decor wasn't about taste. It was about not dying. The wind danced in through cracks that multiplied with every freeze-thaw cycle, and peasants plugged them with whatever they could find. Moss, old rags, tufts of sheep's wool, probably a dead rat or two if it was soft and vaguely heat-retaining. The cold came from all directions. From above, where your thatch roof sagged and leaked. From the sides, where the wind licked the mud walls. And from below, where the floor was just dirt pretending to be solid. When it rained or snowed, the water rose up into your home like it was invited. Every step inside could feel like wading through a frozen swamp. Even when you were indoors, you were never really safe. Every night was a dice roll. Every morning you woke up still breathing. You thanked your lucky stars and maybe your goat, who was probably curled up at your side like an unwilling hot water bottle. Because yes, livestock slept indoors. Not for convenience, but because body heat was body heat, even if it came with snorting and droppings and the occasional midnight hoof to the ribs. You didn't share a room with animals, you shared survival. And still, the cold found ways to get to you. It seeped into your lungs. Breathing too deeply meant pulling icy air straight into your chest, and in a time when pneumonia was a death sentence, every inhale was a gamble. Parents taught their children how to breathe quietly, slowly through the nose, as if winter could hear you and would pounce at the first gasp. At night, you buried your face under a wool cloak and hoped the smell of 3-month-old goat sweat didn't kill you before the frost did. Fire was your only weapon. The hearth wasn't just a fire pit, it was life. It gave light, it cooked your sad turnip stew, it kept the darkness from feeling like a tomb. And if it went out, that wasn't an inconvenience, that was an emergency. You didn't just let the fire die. You banked it, carefully buried the embers under ash, whispered a prayer to whatever saint you thought might be listening, and begged it would still be glowing when you woke. Restarting it meant flint, steel, desperation, and usually fingers too frozen to function. Sometimes you slept in shifts just to guard the flame, because if it died, so might you. And yet somehow people made it. They survived. Not comfortably, not happily, but doggedly, wrapped in layers of scratchy wool and sheer stubborn will. They woke up with frost in their hair and ice in their buckets, looked around their freezing homes and thought, well, still alive, guess it's turnip time. And in that grim determination, that refusal to let winter win, they laid the foundations for everything that came after. Not with swords or kings, but with smoke, straw, soot, and an almost absurd level of tolerance for being cold. Medieval peasants didn't conquer winter. They endured it. One breath, one ember, one miserable frozen toe at a time. If you think your apartment is drafty because your window doesn't close quite right, let me introduce you to the medieval peasant hut, a structure so humble, so absurdly ill-equipped for life, let alone winter, that calling it a house is generous to the point of comedy. These homes weren't built with comfort in mind. They were built with desperation, mud, and just enough cow dung to hold your dignity together. Barely. Picture this: 4 walls made of wattle and daub, which is a fancy historical term for a crisscross lattice of sticks smeared with a generous helping of wet mud, straw, and, you guessed it, animal waste. It wasn't gross, it was resourceful. Manure was sticky, cheap, and always available. And when your building options were limited to whatever your livestock dropped and whatever didn't blow away, you made do. The results? A house that looked like it was halfway through melting, held together by hope, habit, and the kind of resilience that only develops when death by exposure is a nightly risk. These huts didn't insulate so much as they participated in the weather. If it rained outside, congratulations, it was also raining inside. If the wind picked up, the house didn't block it. It just funneled it through every crack and gap, like a medieval version of forced air conditioning, only with added mud and frostbite. Thatched roofs made from layers of straw, reeds, or rushes looked charming in a children's book sort of way, but in real life they sagged under the weight of snow, leaked constantly, and occasionally collapsed if you sneezed too hard. Wildlife found them irresistible. Birds nested in the rafters, rats scurried overhead. Sometimes the roof would give way mid-blizzard and drop a startled squirrel directly into your dinner. And these roofs weren't just above you, they were part of your life. They dripped, they creaked, they sometimes smoked when the fire went wrong. You didn't just live under the roof, you lived with it, like an awkward roommate who never did its job and always smelled like moldy grass. Now let's talk about the floor, if you can call it that. There was no wooden substructure, no stone base, no protection whatsoever. It was just dirt, plain, honest, unforgiving dirt, sometimes packed down, sometimes not, and almost always damp. In the winter, it transformed into something special, a semi-frozen swamp that seeped cold up into your bones and occasionally bubbled with mysterious puddles that may or may not have been chicken-related. You could try to fight the cold by covering the floor with straw or dried rushes, but this was a short-lived illusion of comfort. The straw flattened fast, turned moldy faster, and attracted everything from fleas to fungi to things better left undescribed. If you layered more on top without cleaning out the old, which, spoiler alert, people often did, you'd eventually create a kind of compost pile right in your own home. It squished when you stepped on it. It moved, it smelled, but it was better than the raw ground, and that was your choice. Moldy straw or frozen toes. Welcome to medieval interior design. And then there were the walls, those drafty, crumbling barriers that offered all the security of a sneeze. Remember, they were mostly mud and sticks, and mud dries. It cracks, it flakes, it falls off. You didn't just patch your walls once, you patched them constantly, with whatever you could find. Moss, old rags, strips of cloth, animal hair, sheep's wool, hay, even more dung. Anything vaguely spongy or warm was jammed into the holes in a kind of yearly ritual of, please don't let winter murder me. Entire families would smear new layers of mud and manure onto the outside of their homes in early autumn, chanting the ancient peasant mantra, this is fine, this is luxury. And it was, sort of. It kept the wind out, for a little while, until it rained, or snowed, or thawed. And then you were back to plugging holes like you were trying to keep a sinking ship afloat with goat hair and prayers. There were no real windows, maybe a hole or two covered with animal hide or a wooden shutter. But glass? Forget it. Even the Lord's Manor might only have a single tiny pane, more a status symbol than a functioning window. Peasants were just thrilled if their wall coverings didn't blow away mid-blizzard. And doors? Just planks, maybe on hinges if you were fancy. More often, it was a crude barrier wedged into place with a stick and the eternal hope that wolves couldn't work levers. In short, the entire structure was less a house and more a slightly warmer spot on the ground. It was protection in theory, shelter in spirit. Your best defense against the elements was not the building, but your wits, and maybe a cow sleeping next to you. Because yes, animals were part of the household. They generated heat, they guarded against thieves, and if your walls weren't doing their job, it helped to have a pig to snuggle. So when you think of home in the medieval peasant world, don't imagine four walls and a roof. Imagine mud smeared with cow dung, sagging under the weight of winter, dripping into your stew, groaning in the wind, and filled with the stench of damp rushes, wood smoke, old socks, and a goat named Gerald. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't warm, but it was home, just barely. If medieval peasant homes had a soul, it wasn't the door, the walls, or the straw-stuffed bedding. It was the fire. Not a fireplace, not a hearth in the modern, charming marshmallow toast by the mantel sense. No, this was a smoky, smoldering pit in the middle of the room, dug into the dirt floor and framed by a few blackened stones that had seen more burnt turnips than good days. This fire didn't crackle cheerfully like the ones you see in cozy winter cabins. It hissed, choked, and coughed like it was trying to quit something. It was temperamental, needy, and prone to either dying too fast or setting something on fire when you looked away. But for all its flaws, this fire was the most important thing in a medieval peasant's life, because without it, you didn't just lose comfort. You lost your light, your warmth, your food, your ability to stay alive through the night. The hearth wasn't just the center of the room, it was the center of existence. It was your stove, your furnace, your nightlight, your entertainment system, and your family's last line of defense against the kind of cold that froze chickens solid and made you seriously reconsider how attached you were to your fingers. Peasant homes had no chimney. None. So the smoke, rather than floating politely out of the roof, decided to hang around, filling the air like a thick wool blanket you couldn't take off. It crept into every corner, seeped into your tunic, clung to your hair, and turned your lungs into sad little smokehouses. You didn't just smell like a bonfire. You lived in one, but there was an upside. The smoke killed fleas. And if you've ever lived through a medieval winter while sharing a hay mattress with your cousin, 2 goats, and 17 insects, you'd take whatever pest control you could get, even if it meant coughing like a dying bard every morning. But no matter how smoky or stubborn, keeping that fire alive was a full-time job. If the flames went out in the middle of the night, you didn't just mutter and toss another log on like some lazy modern homeowner. You panicked, because relighting it wasn't easy. Matches hadn't been invented. Lighters were science fiction. You had flint, steel, and maybe a little tinder if you hadn't already burned it all, trying to boil last night's soup. That meant someone had to be on fire duty at all times, especially overnight. Enter the art of fire banking, a practice as sacred as it was smoky. Before bedtime, a family member, often the one least good at excuses, would take a shovel or a flat stick and bury the glowing embers under a mound of ash, not too tightly or they'd suffocate, not too loosely or the cold would sneak in and snuff them out. It was like tucking in a very angry baby dragon and hoping it would still be breathing in the morning. Done right, you could wake up, poke the ashes, add some wood, and voila, fire. Done wrong, and you woke up to frostbitten eyebrows and a 2-hour from flint-sparking nightmare. Everyone had their own method. Some said only dry ash worked. Others swore a little dampness was the trick. Some packed the embers tight. Others let them breathe. It was the medieval version of arguing over how to make the perfect cup of coffee, only with higher stakes and more goat hair involved. And sometimes, even if you did everything right, the fire still betrayed you. A rogue draft might sneak through a cracked wall and blow it out. A clumsy sheep might stumble into the embers while trying to steal your sleeping spot, and if that happened, you either tried to reignite it, good luck with frozen fingers and half-dead flint, or begged your neighbor for a burning coal like a soot-covered peasant version of "Can I borrow a cup of sugar?" The fire wasn't just survival, it was social. Families gathered around it not because they wanted to, but because it was the only warm place in the house. It was where dinner was cooked, where stories were told, where songs were mumbled half-heartedly after a long day of mud and disappointment. It was where children learned to blow gently on kindling and how to poke embers without setting themselves on fire, though many failed this particular test. It was the glow you stared at instead of a television, the thing you gossiped around instead of a group chat, the source of drama when the wood ran low and someone blamed Uncle Bertram for not gathering enough sticks before the snowstorm. It created rituals, patterns, a rhythm to the night. Everyone knew when it was time to bank the fire, who was checking it after midnight, who was responsible for finding dry fuel, and who had to sit closest to it to protect the baby or the grandfather. Sleeping spots were assigned based on proximity to the flames. Prime real estate was right next to the fire pit. If you were elderly, sick, or just lucky, that was your spot. Everyone else fanned out like heat-desperate satellites, forming a living constellation of shivering limbs and shared breath. And if you fell asleep too far from the center, good luck. You might as well have been camping outside in January wearing nothing but moral support. Even animals knew the fire was the heart. Dogs curled up by the warmth, tails dangerously close to the coals. Chickens wandered over and roasted themselves without invitation. Pigs plopped down with the same confidence as family members. And no one complained, because a warm pig was still a heat source. A dangerously smelly one, sure, but in winter, warmth trumped pride. In the end, the hearth wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient, but it was everything. Without it, there was no morning, no porridge, no light, no life. It was dirty, smoky, and unreliable, but it was the one thing that stood between a medieval peasant and the endless, ice-laced night. So the next time you light a candle, turn up the thermostat, or complain that your fireplace remote is acting up, pause. Somewhere, in a long-forgotten corner of history, a soot-covered peasant is nodding silently from across time, whispering, "Must be nice." If you've ever complained about putting on a second sweater in December, allow me to introduce you to the medieval peasant's winter wardrobe, a collection of garments so unwashed, so ill-fitting, and so strategically filthy, it would make even the most devoted thrift shop minimalist break into a cold sweat. In the Middle Ages, dressing for winter wasn't about fashion, it wasn't about comfort, it wasn't even about looking presentable. It was about not dying. Simple as that. Forget layering like a sleek Instagram influencer with matching neutrals and smart thermal gear. Medieval peasants layered like panicked onions, lumpy, itchy, and increasingly desperate. You didn't plan an outfit, you wore everything you owned. If you had 2 tunics, congratulations, you were now wearing 2 tunics. If you had 3, you put them all on and prayed they didn't freeze solid. Coats? Only for the rich. The rest made do with a cloak, sometimes made from rough spun wool, sometimes stitched together from whatever scraps you hadn't already burned for fuel. If you were lucky, it was lined with sheepskin. If you were really lucky, the sheep had been relatively clean. Spoiler, they never were. There was no base layer and outer layer in the peasant-style book. It was more like the stuff that scratches your armpits and the stuff that scratches your knees. Under it all, a linen shirt that hadn't been properly washed since last spring, because in winter, laundry was a logistical nightmare. Washing meant breaking through a frozen stream, soaking your only shirt in glacier runoff, and then standing around for 2 days hoping it would dry before you got pneumonia. Most peasants skipped the risk and simply embraced the grime. And here's the wild part, it actually helped. All that dirt, sweat, smoke, and animal grease caked onto your clothing over weeks, and months, let's be honest, formed a kind of insulation. Modern folks call it disgusting. Medieval peasants called it survival. The layers trapped body heat and clogged up the tiny gaps in your fabric, turning your stinky tunic into a semi-waterproof, wind-resistant barrier. A peasant in February might have smelled like a cheese wheel that got lost in a chimney, but they were warm. Warmish. At least, not frozen. And let's talk about the textures. Medieval winterwear didn't caress the skin, it attacked it. Wool was coarse, linen was scratchy, leather was stiff, everything itched, everything pinched. If it didn't chafe your thighs, it wasn't working hard enough. Children were wrapped in so many layers they waddled like overstuffed dumplings. The goal wasn't freedom of movement, it was to trap as much warmth as humanly possible before your breath turned to icicles. And your boots? If you had boots, they were wooden clogs or leather turn shoes if you were lucky, sometimes stuffed with straw, rags, or animal hair to fight off the bitter chill. More often, peasants just wrapped their feet in cloth and hoped for the best. No Gore-Tex, no wool socks, just foot burritos made of sadness. Accessories? Sure, if you count rags tied around your hands as gloves. Some peasants stitched together scraps of leather into fingerless mittens, but most just shoved their hands under their arms and grumbled. Hats were the MVP of winter. A simple woolen cap could be the difference between waking up with ears and waking up with frozen nubs where ears used to be. Scarves weren't fashion statements. They were lengths of old fabric wound around your neck and face like a medieval ninja trying not to breathe in a snowstorm. And believe it or not, some people slept like that too, face half covered, mouth breathing through the layers, looking like a slightly terrified bandit about to pass out from smoke inhalation. But it wasn't just about the cold air. Wetness was the true enemy. If your clothes got soaked by snow, sleet, or the lovely slop that built up on your mud-packed floor, you were in real trouble. Wet wool didn't dry quickly. It froze. And once frozen, it didn't provide warmth. It turned into a medieval body trap, a stiff crust of icy misery wrapped around your ribs, which is why peasants walked around in layers that hadn't been taken off in weeks. Taking off clothes meant risking frostbite, or revealing parts of your skin to the icy draft, which was basically medieval Russian roulette. It's also why changing clothes wasn't really a thing. Instead, you just added more. New tunic? Toss it on top. Extra cloak? Layer it over the other one. By midwinter, some folks were wearing so many garments they looked less like humans and more like angry laundry piles on legs. And the smell. Oh, the smell. It wasn't just bad, it was legendary. A combination of sweat, smoke, animal musk, old turnip stew, and whatever had been fermenting under your armpit since the Feast of St. Martin. But here's the thing. Everyone stank. You didn't walk around judging each other's odor. You were too busy trying to keep your nose from freezing off. Hygiene was an afterthought, a springtime luxury. You weren't bathing regularly. You weren't laundering anything. You were surviving, wrapped in filth like it was armor forged in the fires of desperation. In fact, some folks believed that washing in winter made you sick. Removing that thick, protective layer of grease and dust was like peeling the shell off a turtle. It left you vulnerable. So they didn't bathe, didn't scrub, didn't even change underclothes if they could avoid it. And weirdly, they weren't entirely wrong. In the absence of proper heat or clean towels or any form of sanitation, exposing your body to water in the middle of a medieval winter really could kill you. So they stayed dirty, and the dirt stayed warm, and everyone got on with their lives, covered in soot and hope. So the next time you're dreading putting on a puffer jacket or complaining that your scarf doesn't match your gloves, just remember, somewhere in the past, a medieval peasant was bundling up in 3 months' worth of unwashed goat-scented wool, stuffing their feet into straw-stuffed clogs, and waddling out into a blizzard to chop firewood with numb fingers in a prayer. They weren't stylish, they weren't fresh, but they were survivors. And in a time when the cold could kill you in your sleep, fashion be damned, survival was the only look that mattered. In medieval peasant life, the word bed was less a noun and more a cruel joke. If you're imagining something remotely resembling a mattress, stop. Delete that image from your mind. There was no soft cushioning, no fluffed pillows, and certainly no clean sheets tucked in with hospital corners. A medieval peasant's bed was, at best, a lumpy sack stuffed with hay or straw. At worst, it was just a scratchy pile of damp rushes tossed straight onto the mud-packed floor, maybe with a few leftover turnip peels and a chicken feather or two mixed in for extra texture. There was no such thing as memory foam, unless you count the memories of every miserable winter night embedded into that flattened mound of soggy grass. And let's talk about what else was in that straw. Mold? Always. Fleas? Absolutely. Lice? Without a doubt. Entire ecosystems thrived inside medieval bedding. You didn't lie down so much as become one with the straw, a host body for a small, buzzing, biting micro-society. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You were experiencing the authentic medieval sleep cycle. And if you think you were getting that straw to yourself, think again. Beds were communal, very communal. Privacy was not a concept that existed. A medieval peasant household, one room, dirt floor, no insulation, meant sleeping in a pile, literally. The family, the livestock, maybe a neighbor or two if things got desperate. Everyone clumped together into what can only be described as a living, snoring, shivering lasagna. The rule was simple. The more bodies, the more warmth. Personal space was for the rich and the dead. You snuggled whoever was next to you, whether it was your grandmother or a goat named Agnes. Babies and the elderly were placed in the center, surrounded by a protective layer of warmer, stronger bodies. Strategic warmth placement was the only heating system most peasants had, unless you count a half-dead fire pit sputtering in the corner, which usually didn't reach anyone past the front row. Now, if you think sleeping near a fire sounds cozy, remember this: no chimney, lots of smoke, open flames, wooden rafters, and flammable straw. A good night's sleep included smoke in your lungs and embers in your hair. A bad night meant a goat kicked a burning log into your foot. But still, the fire was a coveted source of heat. If you were lucky or important or very, very old, you got to sleep close enough to toast one side of your body. Everyone else huddled in the dark, shivering under wool cloaks and scratchy tunics, breathing shallowly to avoid sucking in icy air and waking up with lungs full of pneumonia. And if you slept on the edge of the human pile, God help you. That was the cold zone, the medieval version of the couch, one roll away from the draft that whistled through the gap in the wall and froze your backside before midnight. You'd fall asleep warmish, pressed against your cousin's ribs, and wake up stiff, angry, and wondering if that goat snoring beside you was stealing your body heat on purpose. The beds, or again, beds, weren't just bad. They were alive. Straw doesn't stay fluffy forever. It compresses, it rots, it collects sweat, grease, and food crumbs, and it moves. It shifted beneath you as you tossed, turned, or got elbowed by a sibling having a nightmare about being drafted into the Crusades. Some households made efforts to keep it fresh, tossing in herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the smell. It helped, for maybe a day. After that, the aroma became a violent cocktail of moldy grass, unwashed feet, barnyard essence, and whatever died in the corner last week. Changing the bedding wasn't a nightly routine. It was a seasonal event. You didn't flip the straw, you buried it under more straw and pretended the wriggling was just your imagination. And yet, for all its horrors, the communal sleeping arrangement had its comforts, sort of. Families talked in bed, they sang, they prayed, they mumbled jokes or stories while pressed together in the dark. You might fall asleep listening to your grandfather snoring on one side, your sister whispering gossip on the other, and a chicken softly clucking from the rafter above. The chaos was its own kind of closeness. There was no shutting doors or retreating to your own room. You were stuck with each other, smells, farts, dreams, and all. And somehow this built bonds that outlasted even the worst winters. In a strange way, that pile of bodies, blankets, and bedding bugs was home. Of course, there were hazards. Sudden shifts in the pile meant you might roll into a cold spot, or worse, off the bedding entirely and onto the dirt. Waking up in mud with a pig's tail in your mouth was a real possibility. And don't even think about getting up to pee in the middle of the night, unless you wanted to step on something squishy, loud, or alive. Many peasants used chamber pots, sure, but many others didn't. The corner of the room served as a very functional, if tragic, solution. And with livestock indoors, distinguishing between your family's contributions and the cows was more of a philosophical dilemma than a hygienic one. So no, sleeping in a medieval peasant home wasn't peaceful. It wasn't restful. It was a nightly test of endurance, a challenge to see how much discomfort, smell, itchiness, and general claustrophobia a human could endure in pursuit of warmth. But in that pile of hay and humanity, people survived. They did what they had to. They curled up together like hibernating animals, breathing shallow, sharing body heat, hoping the fire held and the frost stayed outside. And if they woke up in the morning, eyes blinking, joints aching, straw in their hair, possibly with a chicken roosting on their chest, they counted it as a win. Another night beaten, another day to suffer through with your toes intact. So the next time you sink into your memory foam mattress, stretch out under a freshly washed blanket, and grumble about your pillow being too firm, Remember this. Once upon a time, your ancestors were sleeping shoulder to shoulder with their entire family, wrapped in smoke-stained cloaks, lying on fermented straw while fleas held raves in their socks. And somehow, they still managed to get up the next morning and do it all over again. In the Middle Ages, if you ever found yourself cozying up at night next to your wife, 2 kids, and a full-grown goat named Gertrude, don't worry, you weren't weird. You were practical. Because in a medieval peasant household, livestock didn't just live near you. They lived with you, right there in the one-room hovel you called home, sleeping beside your straw pile like a particularly hairy, 4-legged roommate who snored louder than Uncle Thaddeus and occasionally pooped on your shoes. Cows, pigs, goats, chickens, these weren't barn animals kept at a respectable distance. They were heating systems, security alarms, emergency food, and yes, in winter they were big, smelly, snorting bed warmers that made the difference between life and death. Let's set the scene. You're a peasant. Your house is made of mud, sticks, and enough cow dung to qualify as a fire hazard. There's no insulation, no fireplace, no real floor, just cold, damp earth with a few moldy rushes tossed over it like a blanket of lies. The wind howls through the gaps in your thatched roof. Your breath is visible indoors. Your bones hurt from the cold and your clothes are already wearing 3 other outfits. You've banked the fire for the night, hopefully, said your prayers, and you're about to bed down in the human hay pile with your family. But the real MVPs of your survival, standing quietly in the corner, farting softly into the darkness, your livestock. It might sound unhygienic today, because it was, but letting your animals sleep inside wasn't just a quirky rural habit. It was smart. First of all, body heat. A full-grown cow gives off an incredible amount of warmth, and in a space the size of a garden shed, that heat actually matters. You weren't sleeping next to Bessie the cow because you loved the ambiance. You were doing it because she was a 1,000-pound furnace in a fur coat, and her mere existence kept your children's teeth from chattering loose in their skulls. Chickens roosted on rafters overhead, pigs rooted around in the straw, goats curled up like hairy pillows. And you? You squeezed in where you could and thanked the heavens that the pig wasn't in your spot tonight. Second, protection. Livestock was wealth. A cow wasn't just dinner waiting to happen. It was milk, butter, and future calves. A goat meant cheese, a pig meant meat for winter, and chickens meant eggs and endless clucking. These animals were your entire economic portfolio, your fridge, your bank account, and your retirement plan all rolled into one muddy, mooing package. Keeping them indoors meant you weren't waking up one morning to discover your livelihood had been stolen by a hungry neighbor or dragged off by wolves. You could sleep knowing that your most valuable possessions were snoring right along with you. Were you inhaling a mixture of hay dust and pig sweat? Yes, but at least you weren't losing your food supply to a fox. Of course, there were trade-offs. The smell, for one. It wasn't barnyard chic, it was straight up rank. Imagine the combined scent of manure, unwashed humans, wet hay, spoiled milk, and whatever passed for dinner last night, all stewing together in a smoke-filled mud hut with no ventilation. Your nose didn't adapt so much as surrender. The air was heavy, pungent, and vaguely moist. Breathing deeply was a tactical error. But again, this wasn't about pleasantness. This was about survival. Comfort was a distant second to not freezing or starving to death. And the noise. Forget peaceful sleep. Livestock don't care about your rest schedule. They grunt, they cluck, they bleat, they shift in the night, knock things over, chew on your bedding, and occasionally step on your face. Pigs are particularly rude about this. Chickens flap into your head if startled. Goats will casually climb onto things, including you. And cows? Well, they're big. If they move wrong, everyone in the room feels it. But by now you're used to it. You don't wake up in shock when a pig nestles next to your legs. You just sigh, roll over, and accept that warm bacon breath is your pillow for the evening. And yes, accidents happened. Livestock indoors meant dealing with everything that livestock produce. Poop in the corner, pee soaking into the dirt floor, chicken droppings falling from the rafters like nightmarish snow. You did your best to scoop it, push it aside, or cover it with more straw, but in the end your house smelled like what it was, a stable you lived in. Hygiene wasn't really the priority. Warmth was. And if you could survive winter without losing your toes or your cow, you were winning. But here's the surprising thing. Despite the mess, the noise, and the smell, there was a strange sort of rhythm to it, a familiarity. You knew your animals. You could tell when something was wrong just by the way the goat shifted her weight or the chicken fluttered her wings. Children grew up not just alongside these animals, but literally with them. They knew which pig was grumpiest, which cow liked ear scratches, which chicken laid her eggs in your shoes. And when spring finally returned, when the cold backed off and the animals could go back outside full time, it felt a little empty, a little too quiet. You missed the chaotic warmth, the snuffling in the dark, the sense that, even in the worst of nights, you weren't facing it alone. So yes, medieval peasants shared their homes with livestock, not out of laziness, not because they lacked boundaries, but because it was the smartest, most practical decision available in a world where survival meant making every resource count, even if that resource had hooves and occasionally sat on your firewood. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life, shared, smelly, noisy life. And for people with no insulation, no bank account, and no backup plan, that life, however chaotic, was sacred. In the medieval world, even breathing could kill you. And no, that's not a metaphor. When the temperature outside was low enough to freeze your chamber pot solid by breakfast, breathing wasn't just an automatic function, it became a high-stakes survival tactic. For peasants living in the drafty, uninsulated mud and dung palaces they called homes, every inhale of winter air was a roll of the dice. The cold was vicious, creeping in through the cracks in the walls, the gaps in the roof, and the very floor beneath your frostbitten toes. But worst of all, it wormed its way into your lungs. And when that happened, if you weren't careful, you didn't just get a cough. You got sick. The kind of sick that didn't go away. The kind of sick that had names like lung fever or consumption, and often ended with your neighbors carving a crude wooden cross and arguing about whether or not they could eat your last loaf of rye bread. So yes, breathing was a strategy. You didn't just huff and puff like a fool and hope for the best. You were taught, practically from the moment you could walk barefoot across a frozen dirt floor, to breathe slowly, deliberately, and through your nose. Nose breathing wasn't some yoga fad. It was the difference between surviving the night or waking up in a wheezing, freezing fog of regret. Inhaling icy air through your mouth, that was for amateurs. That was for people who hadn't learned their lesson. That was for your cousin Gerald, who hacked up something suspicious every morning and swore he was just fine until he wasn't. The nose, bless it, was nature's tiny furnace, warming and moistening the air just enough to keep your lungs from icing over like a barrel of cider left outside too long. Parents didn't just suggest this. They drilled it into their kids with the same urgency we use to warn children not to stick forks in sockets. Through your nose, they'd mutter before bedtime, pulling a scratchy wool blanket up to your chin. Slowly, don't let the cold sneak in. Breathing was done in soft, careful pulls, like you were trying to sip air without waking it up. Inhale too fast and you'd feel it, the razor-edged bite of sub-zero air carving its way down your throat like a tiny, invisible dagger. That chill could settle into your chest, nestle into your ribs, and bloom into a cough that lingered for months, assuming it didn't kill you outright. There were no antibiotics, no humidifiers, no take it easy for a few days and bounce back by Thursday. You got sick, you stayed sick, or worse. At night, when the fire had been banked and the hut was plunged into silence and shadow, breathing became a near sacred ritual. Some peasants tied rags or scarves around their mouths before falling asleep, not to muffle snores, but to warm the air before it hit their lungs. These makeshift mouth covers, usually made of whatever scrap of cloth hadn't been turned into kindling, were damp, scratchy, and probably smelled like goat, but they worked. Kind of. They trapped the heat of your exhaled breath, creating a little pocket of warmth and moisture that turned each inhale from an Arctic blast into a more manageable, lukewarm gasp. You'd fall asleep with your nose tucked under the edge of your cloak, your breath fogging up the inside of the fabric, and your dreams filled with the distant hope of surviving until spring. There was no such thing as fresh air in winter. Air was the enemy. It slipped into your chest when you weren't paying attention and settled there like a tax collector you couldn't shake. If someone started coughing in the house, deep, rattling coughs that echoed off the daubed walls, you knew the worst had arrived. Everyone grew quiet. Everyone listened, because a cough meant weakness. It meant the fire needed tending more often. It meant someone might not make it through the next blizzard. And suddenly, breathing became a family activity. Parents would huddle their children closer to the center of the bed pile, press warm cloth to their faces, and whisper the instructions again. In through the nose, nice and slow, like Mama taught you. It wasn't comforting. It was tactical. Even the healthiest adult couldn't afford to be careless. Strong lungs today didn't guarantee strong lungs tomorrow. Not when you were waking up with ice in your hair and chickens roosting on your head. It was common for people to wake in the night gasping, startled by the sudden cold, disoriented in the darkness, and punished immediately for daring to gulp the air like a fish. The smart ones kept a bit of warm wool under their blanket to press to their face. The even smarter ones didn't roll away from the fire pit unless they absolutely had to. And if someone snored too loudly or breathed through their mouth in their sleep, they'd be gently nudged, not out of annoyance, but fear. Mouth breathers were tempting fate. Some elders even believed the cold could enter your soul through your breath, that the chill could wrap itself around your spirit and squeeze until you slipped away in your sleep. Whether or not that was true didn't matter. The consequences were real. The winter air was so dry, so sharp, so invasive, it could make a strong man weak and a sick child disappear before sunrise. And when the family woke to find someone pale and still beside them, they knew the cold had won. No screams, no dramatic scenes, just a quiet understanding. They'd breathed too deep, too fast. They'd let winter in. And so every winter night, across thousands of peasant homes, the same quiet struggle played out. Huddled under cloaks and greasy wool blankets, people lay shoulder to shoulder on piles of straw, their livestock farting softly nearby, their fire burning low, their lungs pulling in cold air through careful noses. Nobody moved much, nobody spoke. They listened to the wind rattle the thatch and the embers sigh in the dark. And they breathed, slowly, quietly, strategically, because in the world they lived in, even breathing had to be done with intention. In the medieval world, food wasn't just something you ate because you were hungry. It was your personal heating system, your internal fireplace, your last line of defense against the cold that tried to crawl into your bones and turn your insides to icicles every night. Peasants didn't eat for pleasure. There was no such thing as a midnight snack or a cozy comfort meal, unless you count slurping turnip stew in a smoky room while sitting next to a goat. No, in the depths of winter, food was medicine. It was armor. It was the one thing standing between you and hypothermia, because when your house had no insulation, your bed was a pile of damp straw, and your fire was barely sputtering, the only warmth you could really count on came from inside your own body. And that meant eating something hot, heavy, and ideally greasy before crawling into that cold, lice-ridden hay nest you called a bed. Picture the scene. Outside, the wind howls like a banshee with a grudge. Inside, your fire is clinging to life like it's been personally insulted. Your breath is fogging in the air indoors. You've got one cloak, one pair of socks, and a prayer, and the only thing keeping your body from going full popsicle is a thick bowl of steaming stew, clutched between your calloused hands. It's not fancy. It's not photogenic. It's mostly turnips and barley, maybe some lentils if you got lucky, and a couple chunks of meat so questionable you're not entirely sure what animal they used to belong to. But it's hot, and it's heavy, and it fills your stomach like molten lava poured into your middle, sending out a slow, creeping warmth that somehow reaches your fingertips and toes. That feeling? That's survival. Peasants understood this on a deep, almost instinctual level. You didn't just eat to avoid starvation. You ate to fight the cold. And the best weapon in that fight? Fat. Glorious, greasy, belly-coating fat. In a world where calories were hard to come by, and your body burned through energy just to stay warm, fatty foods were like gold. Lard, tallow, suet. These were treasures, hoarded and stretched through the season like sacred relics. A spoonful of animal fat stirred into a pot of watery broth could mean the difference between a good night's sleep and waking up with your teeth frozen to your gums. It wasn't about taste. It was about staying alive. Meat, when it was available, was celebrated like a festival. Not because it was rare, though it was, but because it carried the kind of dense, long-lasting fuel your body could actually use. A fatty cut of pork was a medieval miracle. A slab of mutton? Practically divine. But even the bones were precious. You'd boil them for hours, days if needed, until every last bit of marrow and flavor had surrendered to the broth, creating a rich, greasy stew that looked like swamp water and smelled like salvation. Add in some root vegetables, a few grains scraped from the bottom of the barrel, and whatever dried herbs hadn't turned to dust, and you had yourself the closest thing to a furnace a peasant could afford. These meals weren't eaten at midday. No, the strategic move was to eat them at night, just before bed. Why? Because once that food was in your belly, your body kicked into high gear trying to digest it. And digestion creates heat. You could feel it, that slow burn in your core that made you a little less miserable as you settled into your communal bed pile, pressed between a snoring cousin and a goat named Marjorie. You might still be cold, sure, but at least you weren't starving and cold. And in the Middle Ages, not the worst it could be, was about as good as things got. This wasn't a feast, mind you. Most nights, meals were a grim parade of boiled grains and mashed tubers, turnips, parsnips, cabbage if it hadn't rotted, maybe some onions that had survived storage in the root cellar. If it grew underground, you ate it. If it didn't try to eat you, you gave it a chance. Spices? Forget it. Salt was a luxury. Flavor came from desperation, maybe a sprig of dried sage if someone had a garden. But no one was aiming for gourmet. The goal was calories, weight, bulk, warmth. You wanted to feel full enough to forget how cold your toes were and how close your head was to the draft in the wall. Hunger wasn't just uncomfortable in winter, it was dangerous. When your body had no fuel, it couldn't keep itself warm. You got sluggish, you stopped shivering, your skin went numb. You went to sleep and sometimes you didn't wake up. So eating was an act of resistance, of grit, of sheer stubbornness. Every bowl of stew was a declaration. I'm not dying tonight. You might be sleeping on a mud floor, wrapped in a cloak that smelled like sheep, next to a cow that hadn't bathed in its entire life. But if you had stew in your stomach, you had a fighting chance. Even the act of cooking was strategic. Fires were precious, fuel was limited, so you made one big pot and kept it simmering as long as possible. Stew could be reheated, re-watered, reimagined with new ingredients, or just eaten as a sort of ongoing, bubbling mystery meal. Did it contain last night's leftovers? Yes. Did anyone care? Not one bit. If it was hot and didn't actively try to crawl off the spoon, it was dinner. The cauldron was the heart of the home, second only to the fire pit itself. It was a source of heat, smell, hope, and occasionally a soggy piece of turnip that made you believe, just for a moment, that spring might come someday. So no, medieval peasants didn't count carbs. They didn't track macros or worry about cholesterol. Their dietary plan was simple. Eat what you could, when you could, and pray it stuck to your ribs long enough to keep the cold out. And if you were really lucky, if the stew was rich, the fire held, and your belly was full, you might drift off into the night, not warm, exactly, but warmer than you would have been. And in that bleak, frozen, medieval winter, warmer was everything. In a medieval winter, when the wind could strip the flesh off your soul, and your bed felt more like a refrigerated compost pile, people didn't just rely on cloaks and stew to stay alive. They got creative. Because sometimes even communal body heat, a bowl of lukewarm turnip gruel, and a goat pressed lovingly against your spine weren't enough. The cold didn't knock politely on the door. It oozed in through the walls, snuck under your bedding, wrapped around your toes like death's little fingers, and whispered sweet hypothermic nothings into your ear. That's when you turned to the unsung heroes of medieval survival. Hot rocks and hay boxes, low-tech life hacks that made the difference between waking up grumpy and not waking up at all. Let's start with hot rocks. These were, quite literally, stones, fist-sized, fire-kissed, and glowing with the kind of gentle heat you'd trade your last spoonful of barley for. The process was simple. You found a rock that wouldn't explode or shatter, important. Nestled it into the coals of your fire until it was toasty, then wrapped it in rags, cloth, or animal hide and tucked it into your bedding like a primitive, slightly dangerous teddy bear. It wasn't high-tech, it wasn't safe by any modern standard, but it worked. These DIY bed warmers were slipped under straw pallets, shoved near freezing toes, or even hugged close to the chest if you didn't mind smelling faintly of scorched dirt. And oh, the bliss of it. In a world where your blankets hadn't been washed since the feast of St. Michael, and your bed was a flea-ridden hay pile soaked in goat breath and regret, that single warm rock felt like a miracle. You didn't need central heating. You needed one blessed, warm thing in your life. And if that thing was a rock, then by God, you were going to name it and treat it like royalty. Peasants knew the trick was in the wrapping. Wrap it too tight, and you smother the heat. Too loose, and you burn a hole in your only blanket. But get it just right, and you had hours of slow, radiant warmth radiating into your bones like the kiss of a particularly affectionate volcano. Of course, rocks don't stay hot forever. That's where the haybox came in. A name that sounds like a medieval insult but was actually a brilliant bit of low-tech insulation magic. The haybox wasn't a box made of hay, although it could be, but rather a container filled with hay, sometimes a wooden chest, sometimes a wicker basket, sometimes just a big old cloth sack, lined with dry hay or straw, used to insulate anything warm that you wanted to stay warm. Think of it as the slow cooker of the 13th century, only instead of electricity, it ran on the eternal desperation of cold, hungry people. Here's how it worked. You'd cook your stew or porridge until it was bubbling, take the pot off the fire, and bury it in the hay box. The hay trapped the heat, held it like a miser with a coin purse, and kept the food cooking slowly for hours. It was a miracle of thermal retention. Not only did this save firewood, a precious resource in a world where dead branches were more valuable than some in-laws, it also meant you could prep a meal during daylight and still have it hot when the sun went down and your fingers stopped functioning. Peasants used hay boxes not just for food, but also for warming cloth, drying boots, or even keeping babies toasty in makeshift hay cradle nests. Basically, if it needed to stay warm and wasn't too flammable, it went in the hay box. And yes, the hay itself helped. Dry, fluffy, and surprisingly effective, hay acted like nature's styrofoam, only itchier and full of bugs. It held heat, cushioned pots, and smelled faintly of barn, which in medieval terms was practically luxury. Some households used extra hay boxes to store warm rocks, keeping them insulated and ready to deploy when the bed turned back into a refrigerated torture slab. You could rotate them throughout the night, like a medieval version of heating pads, replacing one as it cooled and tucking another against your ribs before the frostbite crept back in. It wasn't elegant, but when you're trying not to die in a one-room shack shared with a snoring pig and a half-frozen spouse, elegance is overrated. Let's not pretend this was perfect. Sometimes rocks cracked in the fire. Sometimes hay caught fire. Oops. Sometimes someone forgot to wrap the rock and ended up with a second-degree burn in the shape of a cobblestone. But in the grand scheme of medieval disasters, this was minor. These tools worked. They were cheap. They were reusable. And in a society where winter could be a 6-month death match with Mother Nature, they gave peasants a rare and precious advantage. Even wealthier homes, those rare stone-built houses with actual fireplaces, used these tricks. Servants would heat stones and deliver them in baskets to upper-class bedrooms. Lords and ladies had foot warmers and bed warmers, often metal pans filled with hot coals, which is just a fancier way to say a pan that might accidentally set your bed on fire. The principle was the same. Rich or poor, you had to fight the cold somehow, and hot stones and insulation were the most dependable soldiers in that never-ending war against winter. So the next time you tuck yourself into a bed with heated blankets and temperature-controlled air and think, gee, I wish it were just a little warmer, remember this. Once upon a time, people lit rocks on fire, wrapped them in goat-scented fabric, and prayed they didn't catch their bed on fire just to avoid freezing to death. They buried soup pots in hay. They swaddled hot objects like medieval burritos. They fought the cold with creativity, desperation, and every flammable material they could find, and somehow it worked. They didn't have thermostats, but they had grit and a very warm rock. In the frozen silence of a medieval winter night, when the fire's last embers barely glowed and the wind pressed against the wattle and daub walls like a wolf sniffing for weakness, sleep wasn't a guarantee. It was a luxury, and more often than not, it came in shifts. brief, shivering, uneasy turns parceled out like rations in a siege. Because if your family wanted to make it through until spring without freezing into a communal corpse pile under a damp wool blanket, someone had to stay awake. Always. The cold was relentless. The fire needed feeding. The gaps in the walls needed plugging. And while everyone desperately wanted to curl up in the straw and pretend they'd make it through till sunrise, reality had different plans. So families didn't just sleep. They rotated through a night-long vigil, a peasant's version of round-the-clock life support. This wasn't some cozy candlelit tradition. It was a survival strategy, grim and necessary. In a single-room home packed with people, livestock, and hopes of not dying, sleep happened in layers, both physical and temporal. You'd tuck in next to your sister and the family goat, pull your scratchy wool cloak over your face, and try to drift off, knowing full well that in a couple of hours, someone would jab you in the ribs and grunt, "Your turn." And then it was your job to keep everything from falling apart. Literally. Your first priority? The fire. It was the heart of the home, the only thing standing between your family and the kind of death that comes quietly in your sleep. You couldn't let it die. That meant crawling out of your straw nest, tiptoeing across the icy floor, and poking around the embers like a medieval pyromancer, trying to coax flame from fading coals without coughing yourself to death on the smoke. Maybe you added a bit of peat or tossed in a log if one was miraculously dry. Maybe you just sat there, rocking slightly, hoping your body heat would somehow shame the fire into coming back to life. Next came the draft patrol, because in a house made of sticks, mud, and prayers, the wind had options. It found its way in through gaps in the walls, spaces in the thatch, or even the cracks where the door refused to shut properly. Your job, during your shift, was to find these icy intrusions and stuff them with whatever you could. Rags, moss, a bit of your cloak if you were generous, or, if you were desperate, manure. Yes, manure. Dried, solid, and surprisingly effective. You weren't worried about the smell. Your nose had stopped functioning weeks ago. You were worried about the baby in the center of the bed pile and whether your grandmother was coughing more than usual. Every draft you blocked was another degree of warmth earned for the rest of the family. Then there was the livestock. Those sleeping partners weren't exactly low maintenance. A pig might get restless and start rooting through your rushes. A chicken might wake up screaming because it dreamed it was being chased by a fox. A cow could shift its massive body and knock over your pot of barely warm stew. You had to be alert, not just to the cold, but to every sound in the dark, the creak of wood, the rustle of hay, the sudden absence of snoring from your cousin, who might be dead or might just be finally sleeping peacefully for once. You didn't have the luxury of zoning out. You had a job to do. And when your shift ended, when the cold had numbed your fingers and the fire was once again crackling with just enough life to not die, you crawled back into the human haystack and nudged the next unfortunate soul. Sometimes they groaned. Sometimes they ignored you. Sometimes you had to yank their blanket halfway off and whisper, "It's your bloody turn, Thomas," with the same urgency usually reserved for fire or childbirth. You weren't being mean. You were being fair. This was a relay race against death, and if someone dropped the torch, everyone lost. These shifts weren't glamorous. They were exhausting. Fragmented sleep became the norm. You'd catch an hour here, 2 hours there, drifting off while wrapped in your cloak with your feet pressed against a hot stone and your nose tucked under a rag to warm the air. You dreamed of summer, of sun, warmth, and sleeping without fear. But for now, survival meant waking up when it was your turn. No matter how tired you were, no matter how heavy your limbs felt or how loudly your joints complained, you learned to live in the space between sleep and duty, never fully resting, never fully alert. But oddly, this ritual bred a strange kind of connection. You trusted the others in your home with your life, because you had no choice. You knew that while you slept, someone was tending the flame, someone was watching for danger, someone was keeping you warm, not with blankets, but with effort. And in a world where everything was fragile, your food supply, your roof, your health, that trust was stronger than anything. It was survival in the form of shared responsibility, of bleary-eyed loyalty passed like a torch through the longest, darkest nights. So yes, in medieval peasant homes, sleep came in shifts, not because they wanted to, because they had to, Because in a house where the cold could kill and the fire that could fail and the wind never stopped clawing at the walls, staying alive meant someone always had to be awake, always had to listen, always had to fight the dark. And if that meant trudging through a half-sleep existence all winter long, then so be it. At least it was life. And in the depths of medieval winter, that was the most precious thing of all. In medieval winter, when the cold moved in like an unwanted guest, and survival became a nightly negotiation between your body heat and the laws of thermodynamics, one truth held firm. You couldn't go it alone. Not if you wanted to live. Not if you wanted your kids to wake up in the morning with 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a pulse. The Middle Ages weren't about rugged individualism or stoic solitude. They were about grit, sure, but shared grit, communal grit. Because when your entire world could be reduced to a drafty mud hut, a stubborn goat, and a fire that might give up at any moment, your best asset wasn't your strength or your cleverness. It was your neighbors. And no, that didn't mean everyone got along. Medieval villagers argued like everyone else. They fought over grazing rights and property lines and whose chicken wandered into whose garden. But when winter came, and it always did, sooner than you hoped and colder than you remembered, all that petty nonsense froze right alongside the cabbage. Suddenly, survival didn't just depend on what was inside your own hovel. It depended on everyone else. Because winter wasn't a solo sport. It was a team effort, and the team was your village. Welcome to the most unglamorous Avengers ever assembled. Take fire, for instance. Fire was life. It cooked your food, dried your clothes, kept your stew from turning into a medieval popsicle, and warmed the stones you hugged in bed like sad, slightly dangerous teddy bears. But fires die. Embers fade. And when yours did, when you woke up to smokeless silence and the creeping realization that your last coal had gone cold, you didn't panic. You grabbed a pot or a bucket and you went to your neighbor's door. You knocked. And they understood. No questions asked, no dramatic sighs. They just handed you a glowing ember or let you crouch by their hearth to spark your tinder bundle back to life. Because they knew, tomorrow, it might be them. This wasn't kindness for the sake of politeness. It was an unspoken social contract. If one house lost its fire, that house got cold. And if that house got cold, its residents got sick. And if someone got sick, they didn't just suffer alone. Illness didn't respect walls or property boundaries. It traveled through families, through hay piles, through communities. So helping your neighbor relight their fire wasn't just generous. It was tactical. It kept the village warm. It kept the village alive. And it wasn't just about fire. Food, too, was shared when it had to be. If one family's root cellar flooded or their cow gave up the ghost halfway through January, other families stepped in. Maybe not with feasts, no one was eating well, but with what they could spare, a loaf of coarse rye bread, a ladle of onion-flavored broth, a hunk of hardened cheese so tough it doubled as a doorstop. It wasn't much, but it was the difference between hunger and hopelessness. Because everyone knew, you don't let your neighbors starve, not in winter, not when you might need them next week to help deliver a baby, fix a roof, or chase off a wolf that's gotten too bold. Neighbors also watched out for each other in subtler ways. When the snow piled high and the wind howled like a banshee with a grudge, people paid attention. If they didn't see smoke rising from your chimney, they checked in. If you didn't show up at the well or the church or the communal bakehouse, someone came knocking. Sometimes it was just to scold you for sleeping late. Sometimes it was because they'd noticed you hadn't been coughing lately, which was actually more concerning than coughing. Sometimes they found you wrapped in every blanket you owned, teeth chattering, too weak to make soup, and they made it for you. And when the worst happened, when someone did get sick, when death crept in, despite everyone's best efforts, the community closed ranks. They shared the load. Someone fetched the priest. Someone took the children. Someone lit the fire, tended the animals, swept the floor. Because grief couldn't be indulged for long, not when survival still had to happen. But in those moments, you saw the village for what it was. Not a collection of huts, but a living, breathing web of human connection. Messy, noisy, and occasionally foul-smelling, but reliable. Stronger together than apart. Even the layout of villages reflected this communal mindset. Homes were clustered close, not just for land efficiency, but for warmth, convenience, and watchfulness. One door away from help, one yell away from assistance. In the dark depths of February, when your hands were too stiff to tie your own cloak and your nose had stopped functioning altogether, proximity could save your life. And let's not forget, people talked. Gossip was a survival tool. You knew whose kid had a fever, who hadn't been seen walking to the bakery, who was short on firewood. The village mind buzzed with information, passed from door to door like embers on a long, cold night. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes people turned inward. Sometimes fear or selfishness took hold. But most of the time, especially when it counted, villagers looked out for each other. Because they had to. Because when the snow was high and the world shrank to the glow of a single hearth, nothing else mattered more than knowing someone, somewhere, was keeping an eye out for you. So no, medieval peasants didn't survive winter through sheer stubbornness alone. They survived because they had each other. Because when your world was tiny and your resources were few and your odds weren't great, community wasn't just helpful, it was everything. It was your insurance policy, your backup plan, your social safety net made of hay, moss, and good intentions. It was neighbors knocking on your door with a hot rock, a warm meal, or just a steady hand when your fire and your hope was going out. In the biting heart of a medieval winter, when the cold settled in your bones like a second skeleton and death felt closer than your own blanket, you needed more than hot stew and shared goats to make it through the night. You needed divine intervention. Because in a world where your roof leaked, your fire barely sputtered, and your bed was a damp nest of straw and desperation, there was one more line of defense that peasants clung to like a lifeline. Faith. Real, deep, trembling faith. Not just in God, but in saints, sacred rituals, bits of bone in lockets, prayers whispered into the rafters, and water that had been blessed with more ceremony than some weddings. To survive winter wasn't just about warmth. It was about warding off whatever unseen evils lurked in the dark, cold corners of your world. And let's be honest, there were many. So before anyone even attempted to sleep, a small, sacred routine unfolded in the smoky haze of the peasant home. The fire had been banked, the livestock were huddled close, the stew pot hung low, and then out came the holy water, scooped into a humble cup from a wooden bowl kept near the hearth. This water had been blessed by a priest during some high holy day, and was now your first line of spiritual defense against everything winter could throw at you. People would flick it around the room with their fingers, near the doors, the corners, the windows, or holes pretending to be windows, and especially around the fire pit, not because they thought the water would raise the temperature, but because it might keep the devil himself from slipping in while they slept. And sleep was dangerous. It was in those long, frozen hours, when your body was motionless, your fire was low, and your breath fogged the air above your lips, that you were believed to be most vulnerable, not just to cold and coughs, but to spirits, demons, and whatever spectral parasites medieval folklore had invented to explain everything from fevers to nightmares. So you didn't just go to bed, you armed yourself for it. You said your prayers, you asked the Virgin Mary for warmth, Saint Blaise for protection from throat ailments, Saint Sebastian for plague insurance, and maybe tossed in a word to Saint Lawrence, who knew a thing or two about being burned alive and might, you hoped, have influence over fire staying lit. Blessed candles were lit, when you could afford one, and they weren't for reading, they were for protection. A little flickering flame near the hearth or beside the bed was like posting a glowing, "No evil spirits allowed" sign. You might burn it only a short while. Wax was expensive, but the light, even briefly, was symbolic, a declaration that this house, cold and poor as it was under divine watch. Sometimes crosses were etched into doors with a bit of chalk. Sometimes scraps of parchment with handwritten prayers were hung from rafters, tucked under bedding or pinned to clothing like spiritual armor. The belief wasn't just in God's general benevolence. It was in specific rituals, small repeated acts that gave structure and meaning to the chaos of survival. You'd sprinkle salt on thresholds. You'd recite psalms over a sick child. You might keep a small relic, like a splinter of wood allegedly from the true cross, or a saint's toe bone. No, seriously. Wrapped in cloth and hidden near the head of the bed. These weren't superstitions in the medieval sense. They were tools, every bit as important as the firewood and stew pot, because while you could fight cold with blankets, you needed something else to fight fear, and faith filled that gap perfectly. Even the way people slept was influenced by belief. Many peasants would fall asleep clutching rosary beads, muttering the same bedtime prayer they'd been taught as children, something like, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Not metaphorical, not poetic, but a literal plea, because death didn't wait for polite moments. If your soul wasn't ready, the afterlife could be complicated. So the goal was to go to sleep spiritually prepped, conscience clean, prayers said, candle flickering, and all supernatural exit routes tightly sealed with Latin verses and 3 swipes of holy water. Families also prayed together, not just for themselves, but for neighbors, for the sick, for the pregnant woman 2 huts over, for the livestock, yes, even the goat who kept headbutting the stew pot, and especially for the fire to hold, because if the fire died in the night, so might someone else, and that was a shared terror. It's no coincidence that saints associated with fire and protection were among the most beloved in winter months. Even if you didn't fully understand the theology, you understood the stakes. You prayed, not with flourish, but with urgency. You weren't asking for riches, you were asking for survival. The church, of course, played into this system. It was the authority not just on your soul, but on your seasonal strategy. Priests blessed candles in homes before the worst snows hit. Sermons reminded villagers to pray, confess, and trust in divine mercy. Monasteries handed out blessed bread or charms. And when things got really bad, plagues, famine, bitter cold, you might even join a procession or a vigil, marching through the night by torchlight, chanting hymns and hoping your devotion would keep death at bay a little longer. And who knows, maybe it did. Maybe part of what kept medieval peasants going through the bleakest, most bone-cracking nights wasn't just body heat, or fat-laced soup, or sharing a bed with livestock. Maybe it was the quiet power of belief. Belief that something holy was watching the door. That some flicker of sacred warmth glowed beside the hearth. That some saint in heaven was wrapping you in a blanket you couldn't see, whispering, "Not tonight." Because when the world around you offered no guarantees, when your only doctor was a prayer and your only heater was a rock, you turned to the divine, not because you were weak, but because you were strong enough to hope, to believe, to fight the cold not just with fire, but with faith. Sometimes, despite all the hot rocks, hay boxes, shared stew pots, goat cuddles, and nightly prayers to Saints Blaise, Lawrence, and anyone else who might be taking requests that night, winter won. It didn't care how many turnips you boiled or how many embers you borrowed from your neighbor's fire. Some winters weren't just bad, they were apocalyptic. They came in like a brute, kicked your door down, smothered your livestock, froze your toes off, and laughed while doing it. These weren't the winters where you lost a chicken or got a cough. These were the winters where you lost entire families, entire villages, entire generations. And the poster child for these seasonal horrors? The winter of 1315, the beginning of the Great Famine, when Europe's weather system basically flipped the table and yelled, "Good luck, peasants!" It started with rain, too much of it. Relentless, biblical, cruel. Crops drowned in the fields, grain rotted, hay for the animals molded before it could be stored. And with no food for the animals, there was soon no food from the animals. No milk, no meat, no eggs, just wet wool, sick cows, and chickens too stressed to cluck, let alone lay anything edible. What followed was not just a bad season, it was 3 years of sheer, miserable scarcity, marked by bitter cold, unrelenting hunger, and the kind of death toll that made even hardened villagers stop and mutter prayers they hadn't used in a decade. In the winter of 1315, starvation set in like a slow, cruel fog. People ate anything they could find, acorns, roots, grass, bark. They boiled shoe leather. They gnawed on bones that had already been chewed by dogs. Stories emerged of people digging up the recently buried just to scavenge whatever had been left with the body, or, in darker tales, to eat. And these weren't whispers. These were records, scribbled by monks with trembling hands, stunned that humans had been pushed that far. But they had. Because when your children are crying and your fire's gone out and your last turnip turned to mush in the mud, what else can you do? Disease followed, of course. It always does. Malnutrition weakened bodies, cold weakened lungs. The dampness seeped into everything, bedding, clothing, skin, and with it came fevers, coughs, and things that couldn't be named, but definitely killed. Graves were shallow and hurried. churches overflowed with the sick and the pleading. And yet, in the middle of it all, peasants still clung to life, not because they were delusional, not because they thought things were going to magically get better, but because they were built to endure, because resilience was wired into their bones, whether they liked it or not. Somehow, amid the horror, people still laughed. Not happy laughter, not joy, but the kind of humor that comes when you've got nothing left to lose and death's already slept on your floor 3 times that week. "Well," they'd say, looking at their single surviving chicken, "at least the stew won't be lonely tonight." Jokes were bleak. Sarcasm was sharp. The human spirit? Still kicking. Barely. Because when everything else failed, humor was the one warm thing they could make for free. A joke costs nothing. And in a world where literally everything else could be taken, your food, your fire, your family, sometimes the only thing left to protect was your attitude. Villagers adapted. They had no choice. Communal ovens were repurposed into places of refuge. Food was rationed with military precision. Children were taught not to cry when their stomachs ached, because there was no point. New recipes emerged: gruel with weeds, porridge with bark, bread made from powdered ferns or moss. People figured out how to wring calories from the very ground. And when there was truly nothing left, they simply endured the hunger, huddled together under blankets made of stitched rags, praying the spring would come before their bodies gave out. And yet, even after that winter, and the one after, and the one after that, they survived. Not all of them, many didn't, but enough did to keep the villages alive, to plant again when the rains finally stopped, to repair their roofs and restock their root cellars, and tell stories about the terrible winter with the kind of grim reverence normally reserved for saints and soldiers. They buried their dead, mourned quietly or loudly, and went on. Because what else was there to do? The winter of 1315, and winters like it, weren't just meteorological events. They were social earthquakes. They reshaped entire communities, rewrote customs, changed how people saw one another. They forced unity, bred caution, tested faith, and carved hardship deep into the collective memory. And yet, in that frozen crucible, medieval peasants forged something stronger than any frost, an unkillable will to live. They weren't saints. They weren't superhuman. They were tired, often sick, usually hungry, and perpetually cold. But they were still here. Because that's the real legacy of the worst winters. Not just the death toll, but the survival that followed. The way people rebuilt. The way they laughed again, planted again, prayed again. The way they taught their children how to stay warm, how to breathe slow, how to check on their neighbors when the chimney smoke stopped. The way they passed down the wisdom of staying close to the fire, close to the family, and, above all, close to each other. So yes, sometimes winter won, sometimes it swept in and took everything. But even in those moments, when the hearth was cold, the sky was gray, and the world seemed to have given up, someone was always still fighting, still tending the last ember, still sharing the last crust, still telling a joke in the dark. And that, more than anything, is how medieval peasants survived the coldest nights in history, not just with heat, but with hope.